I stood on the porch of my small farmhouse, the wind cutting through my wool coat like a knife, 32 years old, alone and staring at a winter that had arrived too early and too fierce. My name is Arian Holt, and for the last 7 years I had run Grey Wind Farm by myself. It sat in the narrow valley between human lands and the Orc Mountains, close enough to both worlds to feel the tension, far enough from either to be forgotten. The farm was modest, almost pitiful. One weathered stable for the horses, a hay barn that leaked in every storm, a few acres of barley fields now frozen hard, 12 goats that needed constant feed, and 3 old horses whose best days were long behind them. The fences sagged, the stable roof had holes the size of my fist, and the hay stores were already running low. One man could not keep up with it all, not this winter. So I saddled my sturdiest horse and rode into Barefoot, the nearest human settlement. I nailed a simple notice to the public post outside the general store. Help wanted at Grey Wind Farm. Room and board provided, fair wages, inquire at the farmstead. I did not expect much. Strong men went to war or joined merchant caravans. Who would want to shovel manure, split firewood, and patch roofs in freezing wind for a lonely farmer? I bought a few supplies I could barely afford and turned my horse homeward. On the edge of town, just outside the baker's shop, I saw her. She sat on the cold stone step, a young orc woman no older than 20. Her green skin looked dull in the gray light, and she wore an oversized, threadbare cloak that had clearly seen better days on someone much larger. What caught me most was her feet. She had no shoes, only ragged strips of burlap and twisted twine wrapped around them, now soaked and stained, dark from the slush. Her toes were already an angry red. She did not beg, she did not cry, she simply sat there, eyes down, as if she had grown used to being invisible. I slowed my horse and stared. For a long moment I considered speaking. Then I told myself I could not save the whole world. My own farm might not even survive the winter. I clicked my tongue and rode on. The entire ride home, those wrapped feet haunted me. Every creak of the saddle seemed to echo the question I refused to ask myself. 3 nights later, the snow fell, heavy and merciless. I was carrying the last armful of hay into the stable when I heard it, a soft, almost hesitant knock on the door of the hay barn. I set the bundle down, grabbed the lantern, and opened the door. There she was again. Snow dusted her black hair and clung to her cloak. Her lips were blue, her breath came in short, visible puffs. Those same burlap-wrapped feet trembled beneath her. She looked up at me with yellow eyes that held exhaustion but no plea, and spoke in a hoarse voice, thick with an orc accent. "I saw your notice in town. I can clean stalls, chop wood, tend animals. I do not steal. I do not lie. I only need food and a place to sleep." I looked at her feet again. If I left her standing there another half hour, she would lose toes to the frost. Something inside me, something I had tried to bury under years of solitude, shifted. I stepped aside. "Come in before your feet freeze solid." She did not sigh with relief. She simply nodded once, as though she still could not believe she had been allowed inside, and crossed the threshold. I led her to the kitchen, set a pot of leftover stew on the fire until it bubbled, and placed a steaming bowl in front of her. She wrapped both large green hands around it and drank slowly, savoring every spoonful. Steam rose around her face. For the first time, I noticed the faint tribal tattoos on her forearms, half hidden by the cloak. I sat across from her at the rough wooden table. "What is your name?" I asked. She lowered the bowl slightly. "Maera." Just one word. No clan name, no family, no past. I showed her the small storage room attached to the stable, nothing more than a dry corner filled with clean straw, an old blanket, and a lantern. "You can sleep here tonight," I said. "It is warmer than outside." She nodded again, clutching the blanket to her chest like it was treasure. As I closed the stable door behind me, the wind howled louder than before. I stood in the snow for a moment, lantern light flickering across the yard, and wondered what I had just done. I did not know then that the orc girl, who had arrived barefoot in the storm, would not simply work for me. She would walk straight into the part of my life I had kept locked away for years. The next morning, I woke before dawn, the house still wrapped in the deep silence of winter. I pulled on my boots and stepped outside, expecting to find the yard empty except for the fresh snow. Instead, there she was. Mara stood at the well, hauling up the heavy bucket with both hands. Her fingers were already raw and cracked from the cold. The burlap strips on her feet had frozen stiff overnight. She did not look up when I approached. She simply kept working, muscles straining under the oversized cloak. "You do not have to start before sunrise," I said. She set the bucket down carefully, water sloshing onto the snow. "I have taken the work," she answered in that low, rough voice. "I will earn it." There was no defiance in her tone, only a quiet fear that if she slowed for even one breath, I might change my mind and send her back into the storm. I watched her carry the water toward the stable without another word. By the time the sun finally climbed above the ridge, she had already finished 3 stalls. Fresh straw lay neatly spread, manure piled outside. Every tool hung in its proper place. She had found the rotten harness strap I had been meaning to replace for weeks and mended it with careful, even stitches. She had portioned the hay so the goats would not waste a single mouthful. She moved, like someone who had learned long ago that survival depended on being useful. I had hired stronger men in the past. None of them noticed the small things she saw. Every time she finished a task, she would stand a few paces away, hands at her sides, waiting for my verdict. If I brought her an extra bowl of porridge at midday, she would immediately say, "I can chop more wood this afternoon." I had to tell her twice that the food was not alone. Late on the 4th afternoon, I went into the stable for a lantern and stopped in the doorway. Myra sat on a bale of hay with my old coat across her lap. The left sleeve had torn weeks ago. I had never bothered to fix it. She was sewing it shut with slow, deliberate stitches. The thread was almost gone, so she had torn a thin strip from the hem of her own dress and was using that instead. She did not know I was watching. The expression on her face was not one of someone trying to impress a master. It was the quiet determination of a person who had almost nothing left and still chose to give. I backed away without making a sound. That night, I lit the small iron stove in the storage room beside the kitchen. I dragged in the thickest blanket I owned, a clean straw mattress I had been saving, a basin of warm water, and a heavy wooden latch that could be locked from the inside. When Mayra returned from the evening chores, I led her to the room. "The stable is too cold," I said. "From now on, you sleep here." She stood motionless for a long time, staring at the latch. "I am allowed to lock the door?" she asked. "It is your room," I answered. Something shifted behind her yellow eyes, but she only nodded. From that night, the house began to change in small, almost invisible ways. She started leaving a kettle of hot water on the stove for me each morning. She brushed the old horses until their coats gleamed even in the weak winter light. She hung my coat near the fire so it would be warm when I stepped outside. She repaired the loose latch on the gate so it no longer rattled in the wind. The house was no longer just 4 walls and a leaking roof. It had the sound of someone living in it. A few days later, I rode into Barefoot again and used the coins from selling 2 of my rabbits to pay the cobbler. I described exactly what I wanted: soft leather, lined with wool, large enough for an orc's feet but shaped so they would not slip in snow. When I returned, I placed the finished boots outside her door before she woke. The next morning, I was mending a harness when I heard her door open. I glanced over. Myra stood barefoot on the threshold, the new boots held in both hands. She knelt slowly and ran her fingers along every seam, tracing the stitches as if they were words she could not read. For a long moment she did not speak. "No one has ever made boots for me," she said at last. I shrugged, uncomfortable with the weight of her gratitude. "Working outside in the snow with nothing on your feet is foolish. Keep them." She did not put them on right away. Instead, she carried them inside and set them carefully beneath the bed, where she could see them every night before she slept. I did not understand it then. Later, I would learn that for Mayra, those boots were not merely something to wear. They were the first proof she had ever received that she was no longer something that could be left outside in the cold. The days grew a little warmer. The house grew a little less empty. And every time I looked at the orc girl who would come to me with nothing but a name and a promise to work, I felt the first faint stirring of something I had not allowed myself to feel in years. Hope. The snow began to thin as the days lengthened. Patches of frozen earth showed through the white, and the wind lost some of its cruel edge. I decided it was time to teach Myra the larger tasks. She already knew how to clean stalls and portion feed better than most hired hands I had ever kept. Now I showed her how to walk the fences, how to spot a loose post before it fell, how to ride the old gelding named Rowan in slow circles around the barley field so she could check the far boundaries without tiring herself. At first she sat on the saddle like a statue, back rigid, fingers locked around the reins as if the horse might vanish beneath her. Her green hands were strong from years of hard labor, yet she held the leather with surprising gentleness. On the third afternoon, Rowan stepped into a hidden dip in the snow, and Myra slid sideways. She landed in a soft drift of hay I had piled earlier for the goats. For one heartbeat she lay there, cloak tangled around her legs. Then a sound broke out of her, low. Startled, and unmistakably a laugh. It was the first time I had ever heard laughter on this farm. The sound caught me off guard. I stood by the fence with the bridle in my hand, staring. Myra pushed herself up, cheeks flushed darker green, and brushed snow from her cloak. She looked almost embarrassed, as if laughter were something she had forgotten how to do. But the smile stayed on her lips a moment longer, small and real. That same evening, she asked if she could cook. I shrugged and told her she could burn the house down if she wanted, as long as she did not burn the horses. She worked quietly at the hearth, chopping roots I had dug before the ground froze and simmering them with the last of the dried venison. The smell that filled the kitchen was simple, earthy, warm, nothing fancy, but when she set the bowl in front of me, I ate 2 full servings without speaking. It tasted better than anything I had made in years. "You cook better than I do," I said at last. She looked up from her own bowl, yellow eyes steady. The small smile returned, lingering this time. The real test came 2 nights later. A fierce wind rattled the stable door after midnight. I woke to the sound and pulled on my coat, lantern in hand. When I reached the stalls, I found Myra already there. She had lit the hanging lamp and rolled her sleeves high. The old mare Sella was down in the straw, sides heaving, eyes wide with pain. The foal was coming early and wrong. "I can help," I started, moving forward. Myra lifted one hand without looking at me. "Hold the lantern steady. I have done this before." Her voice was calm, almost low enough to be a whisper. She knelt beside Sella, large green hands moving with careful strength. She spoke soft orc words I did not understand, the same way someone might soothe a frightened child. I watched her reach inside, adjust, pull. Sweat beaded on her brow despite the cold. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then the foal slipped free, wet, trembling, but alive. Myra caught the small body in a clean cloth, wiped away the birth fluids, and checked the tiny nostrils until the colt drew its first clear breath. She sat back on her heels, arms streaked with straw and fluid, and looked at the newborn with something close to wonder. In that moment, she no longer looked like the barefoot girl who had knocked on my barn door. She looked like someone who had carried too much pain and still knew exactly how to protect life when it arrived helpless. "You saved him," I said quietly. She brushed a strand of damp hair from her face. "He wanted to live." I believed her. The following night I woke again, but this time to a different sound. A choked sob came from the room beside the kitchen. I rose, pulled on a shirt, and knocked softly. No answer. I eased the door open a crack. Myra sat on the floor, with her back against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees. Her shoulders shook. The neck of her tunic had slipped sideways, revealing a long, ugly scar that ran from the top of her shoulder down across her back. Old, thick, the kind left by something cruel and repeated. When she saw me, she yanked the cloth back into place, but it was too late. "I am fine," she rasped. She was not fine. I stepped inside and sat on the edge of the straw mattress, giving her space. After a long silence, she spoke, voice cracking like thin ice. "My mother belonged to a poor branch of the clan. They drove us out when I was small. My father died breaking stone in a human mine so we could eat." When I was 14, they sold me to a noble's horse farm as a servant. I cleaned stalls, carried water, rubbed down stallions twice my size. If I dropped a bucket, they beat me. If I spoke against the overseer, they starved me. One night the hay barn caught fire. I ran. Since then I have walked from village to village, working where they would let me, sleeping in sheds, always moving before anyone could chain me again. She did not cry while she told it. She simply stared at the floor, as if the words had weight and she was tired of carrying them. I did not tell her everything would be all right. Some things never are, no matter how many kind words you wrap around them. Instead, I stood up, took the lantern, and went out to the woodpile. I spent the entire next day in the workshop behind the barn, planning and joining oak boards I had been saving for a new stable door. By evening, I had built a proper bed frame, solid, wide enough for her frame, with rope webbing and a thick layer of fresh straw topped by the best wool blanket I owned. When I carried it into her room and set it against the wall, Myra stood frozen in the doorway. She touched the smooth rail as if it might disappear. "It will not break," I said, "and no one will make you sleep on the floor again." She looked from the bed to me. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why do you do so much?" I thought about the question for a long moment. "Because you have made this house feel alive again." Myra did not answer right away. She simply ran her fingers along the wood once more, then met my eyes. The look she gave me was no longer only gratitude. There was something deeper in it now, something careful, something wondering, something that made the quiet winter air between us feel suddenly warmer. I left her with the new bed and closed the door softly behind me. Outside, the last of the snow glittered under starlight. Inside, for the first time in years, the farmhouse held more than one heartbeat, and I was no longer sure which of us had truly been rescued. The first real crack in our quiet world came when I took Myra into Barefoot to buy salt and seed grain. The snow had pulled back enough for the roads to be passable, and we needed supplies before the next storm. She wore the boots I had made for her, soft leather, wool-lined, the first pair of shoes anyone had ever given her. She walked beside my horse instead of riding, head high, cloak pulled close. The moment we stepped through the town gate, eyes followed us. The baker's wife stopped sweeping her step. Two men loading a wagon paused mid-lift. A child pointed and was quickly hushed by his mother. I felt every stare like a finger pressed against my spine. An orc girl, tall, green-skinned, clearly marked by the mountain clans, walking openly beside a human farmer. And not just any farmer. The one who lived alone at Greywind. By the time we'd left the general store, the whispers had already begun. "He keeps her like property. She ran from somewhere. You can see it in her eyes. Bad luck. Orcs always bring bad luck." Mara heard every word. She said nothing on the ride home, but her shoulders drew tighter with each mile. After that day, she stopped asking to come with me to town. She still rose before dawn, still cleaned the stalls until they smelled of fresh straw, still mended every harness and patched every hole in the roof. But the small smiles I had started to count on grew rarer. The quiet laugh I had heard only once vanished completely. One afternoon I found her standing at the fence line, staring toward the distant road. I walked up beside her. "They're just words," I said. "Let them talk." She kept her eyes on the horizon. "Words become ropes, Arian. I have worn them before." I wanted to ride into town and shout at every last one of them. I wanted to tell them she had saved a foal with her own hands, that she left hot water for me every morning, that the house no longer felt like a tomb. But Mara laid a hand on my arm, gentle but firm. "Don't," she said. "They will only say I turned you into a bad man." The words cut deeper than any insult aimed at me. The real trouble arrived 3 days later. I was repairing the fence along the main road when a rider slowed his horse. He was human, broad-shouldered, with a face I did not recognize but a voice I would never forget. Varric, the overseer from the noble's horse farm where Myra had once been sold. He reined in and looked me up and down, then glanced toward the house. "So it's true," he said. "You have my runaway." I straightened, hammer still in my hand. "She is not yours." He smiled like a man who had already won. "She is listed property, escaped servant. I hold the papers. Hand her over, and I will pay you a fair sum. You've had your use of her, I imagine." Something inside me snapped, clean in two. I stepped forward and drove my fist into his face before the last word left his mouth. He toppled backward off the saddle and landed hard in the half-frozen water trough. Blood streamed from his nose and stained the snow pink. "She is not property," I said, voice shaking. "She is a free woman working on my land." Varric dragged himself out of the trough, spitting red. "You'll regret that, farmer. I'll be back with the town guard." He rode away, cursing. I stood there with bloody knuckles and the certain knowledge that the quiet life we had built was over. 2 days later, the deputy rode up with 2 armed men at his back. He dismounted in the yard and held up a sealed letter. "Complaints have reached the council," he said. "You are accused of harboring a runaway orc without proper papers. She must present proof of lawful residence or leave the valley by sunset tomorrow." I stepped in front of Myera, who had come out of the barn at the sound of hooves. "She works for me. Room, board, fair wage, that is lawful enough." The deputy looked at her, then at me. "The town says otherwise. They say she brings trouble. They say you have lost your mind." He left the warning hanging in the cold air and rode away. That night, Myera stood at the kitchen door with her old cloak folded over one arm. Her new boots were on her feet, but her face was the same resigned mask she had worn the night she first knocked on my barn. "I must go," she said. "No," she shook her head. "They will take your land. They will arrest you. Everything you built will be gone because of me." I crossed the room in 3 strides and caught her shoulders. "If you walk out that door alone, I lose something far more important than land." Tears slid down her green cheeks, but she still reached for the latch. I stepped back, throat tight, and began packing. I filled a small sack with cornbread, dried meat, a handful of coins, my second warmest cloak, and the small knife I kept sharp for butchering. I pressed the bundle into her hands. "If you must go," I said, voice rough, "then go as someone who is loved, not as someone chased away." Myera stared at the pack. Her fingers trembled around the straps. For a long moment she could not speak. Then she stepped forward and rested her forehead against my chest, just once, just long enough for me to feel the warmth of her breath through my shirt. Without another word, she turned and walked into the falling snow. I did not follow. I did not call her back. That night the house died again. The fire burned low and sullen. The new bed I had built for her stood empty. Her boots, those first boots anyone had ever made for her, still sat neatly beneath it, waiting for feet that would not return. I sat at the kitchen table until the lantern sputtered out, listening to the wind howl across the empty fields. For the first time since she had arrived, the silence felt heavier than the snow itself. I had opened the door when she was freezing. Now I understood that keeping her here would take more than kindness. It would take a name no one could steal, a place no law could touch, and a choice spoken loud enough for the whole valley to hear. I just did not know if I still had the chance to give her any of those things. The days after Myera left were worse than the worst winter I had ever known. The goats stopped eating properly and grew thin. The stable roof, which she had patched so carefully, began to leak again in the next storm. The fire in the kitchen burned low and sullen because I forgot to bring in enough wood. I moved through the chores like a man sleepwalking. Every corner of the farm reminded me of her. The fresh straw she had spread, the harness she had mended, the kettle she always left filled with hot water. The house was no longer a home. It was simply 4 walls and a roof that no longer mattered. I realized then that she had never been just a hired hand. She had been the heartbeat I had stopped noticing until it was gone. On the 6th night, the blizzard returned with a vengeance. Wind screamed across the valley, driving snow sideways like needles. I sat by the dying fire, staring at nothing, when 3 soft knocks sounded at the kitchen door. I thought the wind was playing tricks. Then the knocks came again, hesitant, familiar. I crossed the room in 3 strides and yanked the door open. Myera stood on the threshold, covered in snow. Her black hair was plastered to her face. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. The boots I had made for her were caked in ice, and the burlap wrappings on her ankles had torn again. She looked half frozen, but her yellow eyes were wide and desperate. "I tried to leave," she said, voice raw. I found work in a kitchen 3 days south. The pay was enough. The people left me alone, but every night I looked at the floorboards, and all I could see was this house. I could not stay away. I do not know where I belong in this world, Aryan, but I know I am not myself if I am not here. Tears froze on her lashes before they could fall. I did not ask questions. I simply stepped forward, lifted her into my arms as if she weighed nothing, and carried her inside. I set her down close to the fire, wrapped every blanket I owned around her shoulders, and knelt to pull the ruined wrappings from her feet. Her skin was ice cold. I rubbed warmth back into her toes until she stopped shivering. She looked up at me, voice small. I do not want to bring more trouble to you. I leaned forward and pressed my lips to her forehead, not in haste, not in possession, only in promise. The trouble was already here the moment I let you walk away, I whispered. The next morning I gathered every document I owned, the deed to Greywind Farm, the hiring notice I had written, the small ledger where I had recorded her wages in careful lines. I counted every coin I had saved, then added the little that remained from selling the north pasture. Get dressed, I told her. We are going into town. She paled. Why? Because I am tired of them calling you a girl without papers in my house. Today they will call you something else. We rode together on Rowan, her arms around my waist. The town square was busy when we arrived. Heads turned, whispers rose like smoke. I ignored them all and led her straight to the magistrate's office. The old man looked up from his desk as we entered. His eyes widened when he saw Mayra. I placed the documents in front of him before he could speak. Mara is my lawfully hired worker at Greywind Farm, I said. She receives room, board, and fair wages. These papers prove it. I have paid the registration fee and the protection tax. No one, not Varric, not the town council, not any ghost from her past, has the right to take her from my land. The magistrate hesitated, glancing at the growing crowd outside the window. This is irregular. I set down the bag of coins, everything I had left after selling the pasture. Then make it regular. He counted the money slowly. Finally, he picked up his seal, pressed it into hot wax, and stamped each document with a heavy thud. When he handed the papers back, Mara's name was written beside mine in clear black ink. I turned to her. My heart hammered harder than it had the night she first knocked on my barn door. There is one more thing I want to record, I said. She looked at me, uncertain. I took her hands, those large, scarred, gentle hands that had saved a foal and mended my coat and carried water before dawn. I do not ask this to give you my name as a shield, I told her. I ask because I want you to stay because you choose to. Mara, will you be my wife? Will you share this farm, this life, and whatever winters still come, not as my worker, but as the woman who belongs here with me? For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the magistrate's hearth. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they were not born of fear. Yes, she whispered, because I choose. The magistrate cleared his throat, stamped one final line, and we were married in the space of 3 heartbeats. We rode home through the same streets that had once stared at us. People still whispered, but I kept my eyes forward, and Mayra kept her hand in mine. When we reached the farm, she slipped down from the saddle and walked straight to the bedroom. She picked up the first pair of boots I had ever made for her and placed them carefully beneath the new bed, side by side with her old burlap wrappings. Not because she needed them anymore, but because she wanted to remember where she had come from and how far she had walked to reach home. That night, the fire burned bright. The house no longer felt empty. Outside, snow fell softly, covering the fields in quiet white. Inside, Mayra rested her head against my shoulder, and for the first time since I had nailed that notice to the post in Briarford, I understood exactly what I had been looking for when I wrote the words, "Help Wanted." I had thought I needed someone to clean stalls and chop wood. What I had found was the woman who would stay with me through every winter that followed. And she had come barefoot through the snow, carrying nothing but a name and the quiet courage to answer a simple notice on a cold day. She had come to work. She had stayed to live. And she would remain, by choice, by law, and by the simple, stubborn beating of two hearts that had finally found the same home.